Blog Talk Radio.
You are now listening to True Murder, the most shocking killers in true crime history, and the authors that have written about them. Gacy, Bundy, Dahmer, The Night Stalker, BTK. Every week, another fascinating author talking about the most shocking and infamous killers in true crime history. True Murder, with your host, journalist and author, Dan Zupansky.
Good evening. Nearly 40 years after Jimmy Hoffa vanished from the face of the earth, his disappearance still remains one of the biggest mysteries in crime history. At his zenith, Hoffa was reputed to be one of the most powerful figures in North America. The labor boss was never seen again after July 30th, 1975, marking one of the most unexplainable cold cases ever. In Vanished, the life and disappearance of Jimmy Hoffa, freelance journalist William Hryb attempts to unravel the 5-decade-long riddle. The author takes the reader behind the scenes of the man who made the Teamsters the most formidable labor union in the United States. Alleged to have close ties with organized crime, Hoffa became the target of sensational congressional hearings into organized crime spearheaded by Robert Kennedy. The book that we're featuring this evening is Vanished, the life and disappearance of Jimmy Hoffa, with my special guest, journalist and author, William Hryb. Welcome to the program, and thank you for agreeing to this interview, William Hryb.
Program.
Welcome to the program, William. Thank you very much for agreeing to this interview.
Well, thank you very much, Dan. I'm delighted to be on the show, and I'm looking forward to discussing this iconic figure, Jimmy Hoffa.
Absolutely. Now, without giving anything really away, just it's one of the questions I sort of am always curious, and I think the audience is as well. Being a journalist that has written other material and at the same time being involved in true crime with the radio program that you did, that you have been involved in, but tell us why. What was it that compelled you to write about Jimmy Hoffa at this time, considering all the people that have written about Jimmy Hoffa? Why, of all the characters that you could have picked, why Jimmy Hoffa?
Well, that's a good question, Dan. Way back in the late 60s, early 70s, when I was attending college, I was taking political science, and the Kennedys came up, obviously, in our studies, and of course, I did a paper at that time, and Hoffa's name came up with the Kennedys. And I was always fascinated about how the Kennedys treated Hoffa. The Kennedys were rich. They were born with a silver spoon in their mouths, and Hoffa came out of nowhere. His father was a coal miner, and he was dirt poor, and he worked his way up, and that was always very intriguing for me. And the paper that I did at that time, we certainly touched on Jimmy Hoffa, and then of course later on, when I was offered the opportunity to write a book about Mr. Hoffa, I looked at the situation and I said, well, do I have time to do it? I want to do a good job, and I thought about it for a couple of days, and I accepted the gig, and that was about 20 months ago. And through a lot of research, I finally completed the book in last November, and it was published in late December, and it's out in the book stores around North America. So I'm quite pleased with that.
Yes, congratulations. Now, let's talk about Jimmy Hoffa, because I think one of the things that a lot of people sort of have ideas, and we can dispel those sort of myths about Jimmy Hoffa tonight because you've covered everything in your book. But really, I think a lot of what I don't know, and a lot of people I think don't know, is the early life of Jimmy Hoffa. What shaped him, and it's very, very. You have a vivid portrayal of Jimmy Hoffa's early life. So tell us, he was born on Valentine's Day, February 14, 1913, in Brazil, Clay County, Indiana, a little ways out of Indianapolis. And
that's right.
Tell us about James Hoffa.
Well, James Hoffa was the third of four children. His father was a coal miner, and he died in 1920 when Jimmy was 7 years old, and his mother really was left destitute. His father actually was worked to death. He had black lung disease. And in those days, the mines, of course, didn't have the protection that they do today. But it's still a hard life today. I mean, let's face it, coal mining is not the best vocation you can have in the world. But people have to do it. But anyway, Jimmy Hoffa's father's death really weighed on him. It certainly had an effect on his attitude, his personality. When his father died, of course, he knew instinctively that he had to help the family, and he took jobs, shining shoes, and he helped his mother deliver laundry. His mother took in laundry, and he helped deliver the laundry. Him and his brother, younger brother. So he certainly started life very, very with a hardship, and he learned from that, and of course when his mother found out that they really couldn't sustain their lives in that small community, they decided to move, and of course the big city Detroit was where a lot of people were moving, and in 1924 they moved to Detroit, and of course he was 11 years old and brand new. He wasn't used to the big city. They actually moved into a urban setting where there was a lot of tough kids. It wasn't the most pleasant part of the city, and a lot of the kids that he met right off the bat called him a hillbilly. And he was a small kid, and he didn't like that term. He didn't like anybody calling him names. So for a couple of weeks he took it in stride. But sooner or later, he said obviously to himself, "I'm not going to let anybody push me around." So he used his fists on these street toughs, and he won most of the battles, and he gained a reputation of a guy who's going to stick up for himself, and he gained a lot of respect for that, and of course that just continued on and on in his life. He quit school at 14. Just to give the listeners out there, he quit school at 14, and he lied about his age, and he took a job at a grocery store called Kroger's. Now, Kroger's today is a big, huge chain in the United States. You find Kroger's all over the place. But in any event, he worked bagging groceries, and he took a job at 32 cents an hour, and he certainly helped his mother that way, and he did that for a couple of years until the stock market crashed in 1929, and then he took a job on the loading dock at Kroger's. Now, at the loading dock, they had a shift. They had a 4 to 12 shift that he was on, and on this 4 to 12 shift, these workers would wait for produce to come in. Sometimes they'd get 2 trucks, 3 trucks. But they only got paid for the time that they were discharging the trucks, and this certainly didn't please the. His co-workers started to say, "Well, why are we waiting around? Why can't we get paid for waiting around?" Well,
let me interrupt you, William. Let me interrupt you, William.
Sure.
I just want to make sure that the audience understands too that at this time, despite the steady job, they still really were too poor to put food on the table. In fact, they're 2/3 of their wages almost guaranteed that there would be food on the table. But regardless, these men were, again, like sitting around waiting for the trucks to be able to unload these trucks, but not getting paid for that. But at the same time, they were poor as well. They were not getting a livable wage.
That's right. And Kroger had a scheme too to pay these guys in food, and that was something that they really didn't appreciate. They wanted the money. Of course, they had no choice. They had to put food on the table. Well, what happened was Hoffa, and he instigated this. He went around to his fellow workers and said, "Hey, this is not fair. They've been doing this for too long. They should be paying us for our time, not just when we're discharging the trucks." So one night in 1931, it was 18-year-old Hoffa, full of spunk. He instigated a strike with Kroger's. And it was known as the Strawberry Strike. I'll give you some background on that. The Strawberry Strike derives from the trucks they were discharging. It was strawberries, very, very perishable. They had to get them out of the truck and into some cold storage. And it was timely because they stopped taking the strawberries out of the strike, and that's why they called it a Strawberry Strike. And, of course, there was the whole car, the whole truck went bad. It spoiled. Well, of course, Kroger, the next morning, they were livid. They were saying, "Well, what's going on? What's happening here?" And somebody pointed the finger at Hoffa. It is that Hoffa guy. So they called Hoffa in, and they says, "Hey, what are you doing? You can't be doing this." And Hoffa stood up to these guys. He really stood up to these guys. He told these guys point blank, "I've got support. We're not going to be doing this until we get paid." And of course, trucks were coming in, and the owners were desperate to get these strawberries into the warehouse, and they relented. And a couple of days later, they signed the first labor union, the first labor union contract, and that really put Hoffa on the map, according to the Teamster Union. So he really made a name for himself for that particular action. And in 1932, he left the grocery chain after he was asked to become a union organizer in Detroit. So he was moving up fast up the ladder.
Now,
but
the thing is, let us talk about too the sentiment at this time towards the burgeoning movement of unions. How were they depicted, we'll say, in the media, and how were they handled in terms of organization by the companies themselves? What did they do in the face of a strike, we'll say? Who did they hire? What was their tactic? Yeah. And tell us how the media conveyed the interaction between the two parties at that time.
Well, companies, of course, they were against unions. And when companies saw that there was a strike action or some sort of a picket line, the companies would hire goons. They would hire people who would rough up these guys and try to break up the strikes. And it worked on a lot of occasions. And there was a lot of people who were left with broken heads and broken arms, and there were some fatalities. Hoffa, he was brilliant. He looked at the situation. He said, "Well, you know what? I need some muscle. I need some guys who are going to counteract this for us. So he went to the underworld. He went to people. He hired people, and he said, "Listen, we've got this happening, and we want you to break up these guys who are trying to break up our strikes." And there was melees in the streets, and Hoffa got a lot of action from these guys, and he was successful. But of course, at that time, there was a situation in the United States where unions were thought to be communist elements, and of course, you had the tide of rising communism, and the media was certainly against all of this stuff. But Hoffa stood his ground. He stood his ground, and he was successful in that respect, and he gained a lot of respect from even some of the companies. They didn't like it, but they had no choice. The Teamsters were growing very, very, very strong. They were certainly gaining a lot of strength in numbers, and of course the Teamsters could have stopped the economy of the United States right dead in its tracks, because they controlled all the trucks moving from point to point. And one of Hoffa's early jobs was to convince truckers to join the union, because a lot of truckers were part of the company. And Hoffa used his tactics. Sometimes he was brutal. He was a very aggressive guy. He was tough, and he was profane, and sometimes bullying. And he would sometimes personally go to these truckers who would be sleeping on the side of the road getting rest, and knock on their truck door and say, "I'm Jimmy Hoffa, and we want you to be a part of our union." And he used that coercion, and that became his trademark, basically. And he knew how to do it. He was innately intelligent and unforgiving, and that uncanny nature was something that was positive for his life work, and where he ended up as the Teamster president.
But he was also
I got to add too. He was really charming too. He was a charming, witty guy, and he could charm the pants off anybody or the skirt off anybody, if that was the case, and that made him a very effective organizer. So he was a sort of he could be, as I said, bullying, but he could be charming too.
Now, at the same time, there was always competition from other unions. So part of Hoffa's legacy within the Teamsters was that they also, ironically, used goons themselves to discourage other unions, competing unions. Isn't that correct?
That's correct. And of course, he tried to get all these unions together. And that, of course, a lot of these unions were at odds with the Teamsters as well. But the real story here is that he persevered, and by the end of the war, he became the president of his local, and he was actually deferred out of going into the army. Of course, there was conscription at that time, as you know, and he managed to get away from that, getting drafted, because he was 33 years old, or in his early 30s, and a lot of these guys were going into the army because they were drafted. But he convinced the government that he had to run the union, and his leadership with the union was more beneficial than him fighting overseas, fighting the Germans on the war front. So he advanced pretty quickly, Dan, after that, there was a lot of raids too. I mean, you alluded to the fact that these unions were competing. Well, they were raiding other unions too. The CIO was trying to raid into Hoffa's influence or Hoffa's union. But like I said, he persevered, and finally, in a convention back in 1952, he was finally put on the hierarchy. He became vice president to the leader, Dave Beck. And Dave Beck ended up being sent to jail for crimes. But his ascendancy to the union top job came very, very, very quickly, and he was young. He was still a young guy.
The thing is with the way the union looked at, and Jimmy Hoffa and his supporters went out of their way to try to depict it this way and try to have credibility in this area, and that he was on the union, he was on the strike. He was there right at the picket line, and he was also came from the same roots as these guys. He really was that kind of guy that would show up. He had that charisma, but he also had that tough guy. And I'm going to protect your back, and it really was the beginning of the idea of what a union really was and how they would sell it to the membership in terms of giving a safe environment, 5-day work week, again, safe environment, but good wages, living wages, and basically sharing in the profits of these companies. Whereas if it was left up to the power of the companies themselves, workers would not have a safe environment whatsoever, and not be responsible for injuries, and not have good wages, and not move towards that. So these unions were very strong. It was an epic battle, and Jimmy Hoffa got beat up constantly.
Exactly.
That's the interesting part of your book too.
Yeah. He was right on the front lines, like you mentioned. Actually, there was a case where he got arrested, believe it or not, 18 times in one day. 18 times. And I couldn't believe that, but it's a true fact. And he was there right on the line. I mean, they respected the union guy, the guy who would go and risk his life practically and be side by side with these guys. So Hoffa gained a lot of respect from these guys, and there was no way but going up and increasing his influence over all these members of the union. And then it all came together when in 1958, he was still a young guy. Like I said, he became the president of the union, and that was the beginning of the end, I think, as far as Hoffa's career, because he was being after that, the U.S. government knew how powerful this guy was, and they were certainly afraid that he could really put a dent in the economy, because he could stop things really quick. So actually, they were trying to get him between 1957 and 1960. There was a U.S. Senate Select Committee on improper activities in labor management, and a fellow by the name of John McLennan, he spearheaded this. And although they were targeting Beck, who was the leader in 1957, before Hoffa came on, as it continued, they targeted Jimmy Hoffa, and one of the counsels for that for the McClellan hearing was young Bobby Kennedy. He was only a 33-year-old young man, special counsel to the committee, and he really went after Hoffa like a bloodhound, and it started a real a blood feud that lasted until, of course, Robert Kennedy was assassinated in 1968. And
okay, let's go.
Yeah.
Sorry, let's go back a little bit, because he can't have all of this interest from the federal government. Enough that the McClellan, the hearings are very serious business, and the allegations are incredibly serious. Now, why is that? It's because he has gone to the mob not just for help with pickets and help with strikes and a little help with organization, is because the government believes he is a mobster, that he is in line with these gangsters, is aiding and abetting these gangsters, and that this union is actually a criminal organization akin to and has something to do with organized crime itself. So tell us what mobsters specifically, if there's not too big a list. I know that there's Frank Coppola and Santo Perrone, but tell us what gangsters and what families they belong to that he specifically had ties with, and tell us then how the government then began to try to indict him for major crimes and, again, reduce his power in this union.
Well, it all started off, I think it was a revelation back in 1957 when in a little town upstate New York called Appalachia, where the mob had a big meeting, had a big powwow,
right,
and they were trying to divide the Anastasia pie, as you would call it. Anyway, during that it happened in I think early in actually November, and it put the spotlight on the mafia, and it was no secret to government authorities that Hoffa was really in a relationship with the mafia. And it was the end, I think, of innocence as far as what the mafia meant in the United States. Up till then, Hoover, who was the FBI leader, always said there was no mafia, nothing. There was nothing to do with the mafia. But of course, that all came to an end when this happened. They caught 100 mafiosos during that raid. But Hoffa was associated with these guys because Hoffa had control of the Central Union funds, which had millions and millions of dollars, and the mob needed money because they wanted to build casinos in Las Vegas, basically, and they couldn't go to a bank. So they went to Hoffa, and they wanted to borrow money, and Hoffa lent them the money. And of course, what you see in Las Vegas today is part of the union pension fund money that Hoffa lent to the mob to build these palatial casinos. But there was certainly a lot of contact with Hoffa in the mob. There was guys like Thomas Lucchese, Carlo Gambino, Salvador Bonanno that he was apparently associated with, Carlos Marcello, Santo Trafficante, those guys, those kingpins. So he certainly was somebody that the government knew was cavorting with these guys, and well, rightfully so, I suppose. They wanted to get Hoffa. They wanted to get the mob, knowing that there was a mob finally.
Now, Robert Kennedy becomes the Attorney General of the United States, and so his personal vendetta against Hoffa and organized crime itself finally comes to these hearings and to actual trials. So tell us about the actual up to those events whereas these hearings come and the conviction happens for Hoffa and some of his cohorts. Tell us a little bit about that.
Well, the hearing started in 1957. It lasted till about 1960. 1960, and of course, they couldn't get Hoffa on anything specific, but they pointed their fingers on a lot of different things, and it made it public, and it really enticed the public to find out more. But they couldn't get anything on Hoffa. Nothing stuck. Now, of course, in 1960, after the McClellan hearings ended, JFK, John F. Kennedy, Robert Kennedy's brother, became the president. First thing he did, one of the first appointees he made was he appointed his brother, Robert Kennedy, as Attorney General. This is when Robert Kennedy had the power, and he had the ammunition now to really ratchet up his attack on Jimmy Hoffa. And of course, they did not like each other. They as I mentioned, Robert Kennedy, when he first met Hoffa back in '57 at a party that Hoffa's lawyer arranged, so that they get to know each other, because they knew Hoffa was going to appear before the committee, and his lawyer thought it would be a good idea to have Hoffa meet Kennedy. Maybe they would get they would get on together, but it didn't. They didn't. So from that one meeting, it just really went down. And of course, during those hearings, if you look at the old tapes on YouTube, you could see how visceral it was. He attacked Robert Kennedy, attacked Jimmy Hoffa. How Hoffa would go back at him. And it was really a blood a hate feud. But when of course Robert Kennedy became the Attorney General, he had the means to form. He actually formed the Hoffa Squad, the Get Hoffa Squad, and there were numerous people. I think there was about 100 people involved in that, to try just to get Hoffa for whatever illegalities there were with Hoffa and in the Union, and they finally got Hoffa. In 1964, he was convicted of attempting to bribe a grand juror, and that's a very serious charge. One of the guys that Hoffa knew, a guy by the name of Ed Grady Parton. He was a Louisiana Teamster who knew Hoffa for years. He was facing some charges, and he was desperate to get off. So he made a deal with the government. He became a rat, and they finally got Hoffa on that charge, and he was convicted. And then the same year he was convicted. Also, he was convicted for fraud. The same year for improper use of Teamster pension funds. So it was a double whammy. And, it was proven he was making large loans to organized crime figures. Then he was sentenced for 5 years on that rap, and then the other one for the bribery charge, he was given 8 years. So a total of 13 years. He tried to fight it. He used millions of dollars of union funds with lawyers trying to fight the rap. So what happened? 3 years goes by. Well, after in '64 when he was convicted, Robert Kennedy resigns as Attorney General. Of course, the year before, his brother is assassinated. And he runs for the senatorship of New York, which he's become successful. Meanwhile, Hoffa's still running the Union, but he's running at a time. Finally, in 1967, he lost all his appeals, and he was ordered to report to Lewisburg Federal Penitentiary to serve the 13 years. And he didn't like that one bit. But he reported there, and Meanwhile, he assigned Frank Fitzsimmons, his longtime friend, so-called friend, to be a caretaker Teamster leader. And Hoffa told Fitzsimmons, "Your job is to try to get me out. Your job is to try to get me out as soon as possible." Well, at first, Fitzsimmons he certainly tried, but he started to get very comfortable in his job, very comfortable. He loved the fast style. The Teamsters had a private jet, and Fitzsimmons liked to fly around. He liked to play golf, and he liked to spend a lot of money. He liked to drink, and he wasn't really interested in the union except for being the head of the union. And Hoffa learned about this. Of course, he was getting all this fed to him in the slammer, and he didn't like that. And of course, when he was in jail, being in jail for Jimmy Hoffa was not the. Jimmy Hoffa was used to tell people what to do, and when people told him what to do, he didn't like it, but he had to do it. So it changed him. It really changed his psyche. He became a different guy. He really became a different man. Anyway, to tell you what happened to Frank Fitzsimmons. Frank Fitzsimmons. Him and Nixon. Nixon wanted. This is in 1970. Nixon was trying to get elected for the 72 election. And, of course, he needed a lot of votes. He needed all the votes he could get. And the Teamsters were a prime target for getting votes. And Fitzsimmons and Nixon through John Mitchell, who was the head of Nixon's re-election campaign, they decided to get Jimmy Hoffa out, which would take care of Jimmy Hoffa in that perspective, because Jimmy Hoffa, there was some fine print in this release that Hoffa didn't know anything about. Hoffa was not permitted to go back into the Union for another till 1980, until his original sentence was up. And Hoffa was released in 1970, a couple of days before Christmas, 1971. When he got out of jail, and when he got out of jail, he looked at the document, and on the document it said, "You cannot go back to Union." To the union activities for all that length of time. He didn't like that. He did not like that. He didn't know anything about it, and he vowed to get back at Fitzsimmons. And of course, that started his quest to do that, to get that overturned. And what the union did for Hoffa, though, they gave him a $1.7 million lump sum payment, which was a hell of a lot of money. In today's money, that would be probably around, I don't know, $12-13 million. Of course, Hoffa took it reluctantly, but he needed the money. But as I mentioned, prison life changed him. It changed his whole personality, and
what did he feel? Did he feel that the everyone owed him? The union owed him. The mob owed him. They owed him a certain something because he took that 5 years on the chin. And let's understand too that Nixon really intervened to get his sentence commuted, because he goes out after 5 out of the 13. But like you said, there was major strings attached. So.
Well, there was major strings attached, and John Dean was the guy who wrote that little clause in there. And John Dean, as everybody knows, was that guy who was the whistleblower in Watergate. So it's all sort of intertwined. But Hoffa was incensed. He was really incensed, and he wanted to get back at these guys, and he vowed to do it. then he started to it was reported that he was working with the FBI during this time, trying to give out information that they could use to try to get the mob in check. He was desperate. He wanted to do this. He wanted so much to get back in the Union that he would do anything. And of course, you look at the where Nixon wins. He wins the election in 1972, and of course, Nixon is still struggling to get where he wants to be, and he's running around the country attending so-called meetings, but not official. He couldn't even attend meetings. He would meet guys in lobbies of different places in these hotels where they have conventions. He said, "I'm Jimmy Hoffa. You know Jimmy Hoffa. Jimmy Hoffa is for you, and you've got to get me back to the Union. I need your support." And of course, the mob didn't like that. The mob didn't like the prospect that he would get back, because they had Frank Fitzsimmons in their pocket,
yeah.
And they had all that money. It was a money tree.
And he did what he was told, right?
He did what he was told. Absolutely, he was a patsy. He did what he was told. But
now, did they actually have a conversation with Jimmy Hoffa like the movies portrayed? Did they actually have some sort of meeting? Somebody in organized crime said, "Listen, it's time to retire"?
Yeah, they did. A fellow by the name of Russell Bufalino looms large. Russell Bufalino was a crime kingpin up in Pennsylvania. Not very well known, but he was one of the most notorious crime and strong crime leaders in the United States. Russell Bufalino. Just before I continue with Russell Bufalino, another guy here who really is looms large was a guy named Frank Sheeran. Frank Sheeran was a longtime friend of Jimmy Hoffa. Frank Sheeran loved Hoffa. Hoffa respected Frank Sheeran. Frank Sheeran was a war hero during the Second World War. He spent 450 days straight in combat duty. Usually a soldier at that time spent 100. But his job, Frank Sheeran's job, was basically to do a lot of the dirty work. When a sergeant told Frank Simmons to take a prisoner in the back, Frank Simmons knew what that meant. Frank Simmons knew you had to get rid of that prisoner. So he honed his skills by doing that, by eliminating prisoners. I mean, that was done during the war. But anyway, he came back and he became a Teamster, and Hoffa and Sheeran, they hooked up. And Hoffa used Sheeran for a lot of muscle work too. Sheeran was a big guy, 6'4", strong as a bull, and he did a lot of the bidding for Hoffa. But when Hoffa started to talk that he was going to spill the beans on all the mafia stuff, on all the underworld characters that he knew Frank Fitzsimmons was dealing with, of course that perked up the mob, and the mob, especially Bufalino. And they said, "Well, hey, listen, we can't let this guy act like this. I mean, he's going to continue. He's going to blow the whistle. He's going to make a lot of trouble for us." So Bufalino, who knew Frank Sheeran as well, because Frank Sheeran worked for Bufalino too in a lot of different ways. Frank Sheeran was asked by Bufalino to go to Hoffa and say and tell Hoffa to just be quiet, just to go. We'll take care of you. Don't worry, you'll be okay. You just don't try to get the Union back, because we don't want you to get the Union back. So Frank Sheeran went to Jimmy and said, "Jimmy, our friend friend, and he knew who that was. It wants you to just bow out, or you know what it is. And that you know what it is was a euphemism for you're going to get rubbed out.
Right.
Frank Sheeran talked to Jimmy, and Jimmy says, "Are you kidding? I'm not. There's no way I'm going to bow out of this. No, but I know too much. They wouldn't dare. They wouldn't dare touch me." Well, of course, Hoffa was wrong. He was wrong. Sheeran went back to Buffalino. He told Buffalino, and Buffalino said, "Okay, start this in motion. We got to get rid of Mr. Hoffa." Well, sure enough, the plan was to do that, and Frank Sheeran, and there's a lot of stuff out there, a lot of information out there that Frank was responsible for his murder, and basically in a really good book called Bay Paint Houses by Charlie Brandt, Frank Sheeran tells Charlie Brandt what, and in 5 years of interview, 5 years of recordings, what his association was with Jimmy Hoffa and what he did. And it's a really compelling book. If our listeners are really want to know about what really happened to Jimmy Hoffa, that is a compelling book to get. But as I say, the plan was put in place, and Hoffa was lured to the Red Fox restaurant on a hot July 30th day in 1975.
How was he lured there? What was
well, he was actually he was called. He was called by one of the guys, mob guys in Detroit. Says, "Hey, Tony Provenzano, big Jersey guy, big Jersey mobster, and a Teamster guy. We want to settle differences. And of course, Jimmy Hoffa wanted to settle differences, and he wanted to see what these guys were going to offer him. And they said, "Okay, we're going to meet. We're going to meet them in outside Detroit." And Hoffa says, "Well, okay, listen, but I want to make sure this is not going to be a big ruse." So the idea was to have Frank Sheeran, who Jimmy Hoffa knew, in to meet Jimmy Hoffa at the parking lot at the Red Fox. When Jimmy Hoffa came to the meeting for a 2:00 meeting, nobody was there. He waited about 15 minutes, and Jimmy didn't like being stood up. He ended up calling his wife and said, "Hey, they stood me up. He says, then he says to his wife, "Make sure you have the steaks on by 4:00. I'll be home." Well, it was the last time he ever talked to his wife. A car pulls up, and there's Jimmy. There's a guy by the name of Sal Briglio. He's in the front seat, and Chucky O'Brien, Hoffa's so-called adopted son. They were driving. And Hoffa says, "Who the hell are you guys? Hey, who the hell are you guys?" And then Frank Sheeran pokes his head from the back and says, Hey, Jimmy, it's me, Frank. It's me, Frank." And Jimmy says to Frank, "Who the hell are these guys? Who the hell are these guys? I thought we were supposed to meet these guys." And Frank calms him down. He says, "Frank, don't worry. These guys are drivers. They're just going to drive us to a place where we're going to meet Buffalino. And not Buffalino, but Tony Pro."
Right.
So he can't. That was his biggest mistake of his life, to get in the car. He got in the car, sat by Frank Sheeran. He thought this was okay. He says, "Let's go. I want to get this meeting over with." So they drive about 20 minutes. They go to a house, and there's 2 cars parked there. 2 cars, and that was a part of the ruse. Jimmy Hoffa figured that was them. that was the guy that they were supposed to meet to get the thing straightened out. And so Jimmy says to Frank, okay, let's get the hell out of here. I want to meet these guys. I want to get this over with. I want to go home. So they get out of the car. Sally Bugs, Brigaglio, and Chucky O'Brien, they drive off. They take off. They don't see him again. Hoffa gets out of the car. He's a small guy. And he walks fast, really walks fast. And in Frank Sheeran's deathbed account to Charlie Brandt, he describes what happened. And this is what happened. Frank Sheeran tries to follow Hoffa, and Hoffa's walking really fast, and he barely could keep up with him. He goes up the stairs really quick, opens the door, and Frank Sheeran is behind him. He opens the door. He looks in the vestibule. He walks in. He looks down the hall. He can't see anybody. There's two cars in the driveway, but there's nobody there. He figures, okay, this is something's up. He turns around really fast. Sheeran has his gun out and shoots him twice behind the right ear. Hoffa falls. He falls, and he's dead. And there's two guys that show up immediately from the kitchen area that he couldn't see, and they put Hoffa in a bag, and they clean up the mess. Well, not yet. They come out of the vestibule. Frank Sheeran turns, acknowledges them, takes off, gets in his car, goes back to the small airport that he took a small plane in to cross the lake to go back to tell Buffalino that the job was done. Meanwhile, the two Italian guys, they put him in a bag, take him out, put him in a trunk. They go back and clean up the mess as best they could. They take him to a mortuary owned by somebody in the mob, and they destroy his body. And that's the last we'll ever see of Jimmy Hoffa. You know, they have these digs in the last 7 years. They've had numerous digs all over the place, and these digs cost about $800,000 million each. They've got 30, 40 FBI agents, and they've got to reclaim the land that they've dug. But they still do it. But I'm afraid to say, Jimmy Hoffa, you'll never see his body again, as far as I'm concerned. And but the FBI is still compelled to search for it if they get a lead, because they just had a lead there last summer. A guy, mobster by the name of Zarelli, said, "Yeah, I know where Hoffa is. I was told where he was." Meanwhile, he was in jail when Jimmy Hoffa was murdered, assassinated. But the FBI thought there was something to this his claim, and he wrote a book, a self-published book about what he thought happened to Hoffa. But there's a lot of theories out there, but I think this one with Frank Sheeran it hits the nail right on the head.
Right. Makes more
but
sense.
You know, this is such a fascinating thing. Of course, Jimmy Hoffa. It'll go down. Recently we lost that Malaysian jet, and that's a mystery. Well, you know what? That'll go on and on and on, just like what this is going to go on and on and on. But people are fascinated with this guy because he came out of nowhere, and he made a name for himself, and he left a legacy. Really, basically, he left a legacy. He did a lot for the Union. He did a lot. In 1964, he signed one of the most important pacts ever a union could ever make. He signed the National Master Freight Agreement. He brought 450,000 workers from 16 1,000 companies under one union, which was quite the accomplishment. And to this day, the Teamsters revere Jimmy Hoffa. They really do. They know, of course, he had mob ties, but he did a lot for the union. He did quite a bit for the union. And, of course, his son, James Jr., he became in 1998, became the Teamster leader. So it sort of came full circle. And he's a lawyer, by the way, and of course, he certainly reveres his father's work with the union, or else he wouldn't have got into it himself.
Right.
But Hoffa certainly left a mark on society. You know, Hoffa. I've just got to add one thing. You know, there was a historian. He's named Thaddeus Russell. He wrote a book called A Renegade: History of the United States. Well, you know, he describes Hoffa as a renegade, and he says the more accidental revolutionaries resisted, and persevered, the more receptive society became to change. And then actually he likens Hoffa to anti-heroes like guys like General Patton. Both Patton and Hoffa, they were brave. They despised frailty, and they showed themselves as the toughest, strongest guys ever. And Hoffa one time he proudly said he was the meanest bastard that God ever created. But and he meant it. But you know what? He did a lot of good as well, as far as my research is concerned. And you could read all the stuff about the Teamsters, and they put him on a high pedestal, and there's a reason for that, because he came out of nowhere, and he worked with the people that needed help, and of course the union movement today is being assaulted by on all fronts, and Hoffa wouldn't have liked that too much, but nevertheless, that's really his legacy.
Now, do you think, given the information, he knew the mob? I mean, he was a tough guy. He certainly wasn't a gangster to begin with, but through his associations, and I mean, he hung out with some of these people, and like you say, they had major relationships. You say he changed after prison. Do you think he really lost his marbles, really? Because who wouldn't know that you can't talk about potentially ratting out the mob? And he talked about being more powerful than the mob with all he knew. And he was, again, if he didn't go to the FBI, he said there was talk of him going to the FBI, and he was running his mouth. Do you really think he had lost his mind by the time he got in trouble with the mob, not heeding their warnings?
Well, I think it changed him to the point where he was not thinking clearly, and he had a mindset. I want to get the union back. I don't care what happens. I don't care what it takes. I'm going to get the union back, because it was his whole life. That's all he did. He didn't drink. He didn't smoke. He didn't play golf. Actually, he thought golf was a silly game. His whole life was the union. And when it was taken away from him, that was a big blow for his ego and for his psyche. And, of course, being in prison for 4.5 years, and being told what to do and how to do it, and these bells ringing all the time telling you what to do, how to do it, because they had a system of bells in jail, in the prison. And those bells were driving him nuts. And I think really it really put him over the edge psychologically. Unfortunately, it was a tough time, and it really, I think, was a catalyst to his behavior, his carelessness after he got out. So, yeah, I think he certainly lost his edge in jail.
Was there some point, though, that because of his relationship with these gangsters, and it's evident the way you describe it in the book, the last minutes of his life, according to his friend mobster, that he really felt he was a mobster, had paid his dues by going to prison, which is really some of the dues that a lot of gangsters have under their belt. Did he really feel that he had that ability to, hey, I'm going to have a talk with these guys, and they're going to listen to what I have to say, and I'm going to be back home for some steaks, so we're going to get this meeting over with? So was he maybe deluded in that respect, but thinking because he had a relationship with him, his friend was in the back seat, that I think things really work out?
He didn't fool himself. I think he knew that he was certainly probably barking up the wrong tree. But he was so stubborn. He thought he would be able to push the mob around. He thought he would be able to do that. And there's where that carelessness came in, and it didn't work at all. It ended up killing him. But he knew how powerful the mob was. But he like I said, he was a very stubborn man. He had his own idea how to do things. So I think, as we discussed, prison life really didn't really put him over the top, and I think that made him not realize that he could lose his life over this. And of course, that's what happened.
Right. Well, you've really depicted this in an incredible way in this book, Vanished, The Life and Disappearance of Jimmy Hoffa. I want to thank you very much for coming on. Tell us how people might be able to contact you or connect with you. Do you do the Facebook thing and your website? And tell us a little bit about your new radio program. Tell us about your former program, because I'm sure in the archive people can enjoy the programs you did do. So tell us a little bit about that and how people might be able to contact you and how they may be able to get this book from Strategic Media.
Yeah, absolutely. First of all, the book is available at Chapters all over the country and the United States. It's available Barnes & Noble. Actually, I'm having a book signing here at Chapters on Saturday at 1 o'clock to 3 o'clock. And also, yes, I'm launching my new show called Spectrum, with Will Hryb. It's going to be broadcast every Wednesday, every month at 8 o'clock Eastern Standard Time, and we're excited about our first guest. It's a fellow named Dr. Liebert, Dr. John Liebert. He wrote a fascinating book on post-traumatic stress disorder. So we're going to have him as our first guest. We're going to also talk about his other book it's called Hearts of Darkness, Why Kids Are Becoming Mass Murderers. And it'll be a fascinating interview for all the listeners out there who are interested in that particular problem, because there's a lot of people hurting themselves after they get out of the Army. And, of course, you could always tune into Crime Beat and listen to the past shows that I was a part of. You could go on that. And that's on the Artist First World Radio Network, so we'll invite you to do that. But we'd certainly urge you tuning in March the 14th to tune in on our inaugural show called Spectrum. It should be quite the interview with Dr. Liebert.
Sounds great. Sounds like you're very busy, and congratulations again on this book and on the new program. So thank you very much, and you have yourself a great evening.
Thank you, Dan. It was a pleasure being on your program. Thank you.
Thank you, William. Good night.
Good night.